So we're officially 3 months into 2026, which means it's time to check in on the Criterion Challenge, and specifically the first 13 films of my year. If you're new to the channel, every year I take on the Criterion Challenge, where the goal is to watch 52 Criterion Collection films across 52 different categories, all before December 31st. This is my second year doing this here on the channel, and honestly, it just keeps getting better. The rules are pretty simple. You could watch this long-ass video of me constructing my own list. You watch at your own pace in any order you want, and ideally, these are all first-time watches. Hundreds of people do this challenge all across the world alongside me on the channel, which makes it such a fun community event, and I love that. So if you would like to participate, the link to Letterboxd user Ben's list, the one who made this challenge, will be linked down below. So today we're just doing a first quarter wrap up of 2026, 13 films down, 39 to go. There are some surprises, some disappointments, and at least one that I genuinely could not stop thinking about for days. So without further ado, let's get into it. What would you do if your partner tried to divorce you out of love? I kicked off my 2026 Criterion Challenge with the Palm Beach Story, a 1942 screwball masterpiece from Preston Sturges that asks a wild question: is it possible to be so broke that leaving your husband is the only way to save his career? If you love the rich person absurdity of The Materialist, you need to see where that blueprint started. Watching the Palm Beach Story in 2026 is a reminder of why Preston Sturges is a legend. It's a surprisingly adult look at marriage, framing divorce not as an act of cruelty, but as a misguided sacrifice. Claudette Colbert flees to Florida to find a millionaire to fund her husband, played by Joel McCrea's, business dreams, essentially trying to buy him out of their poverty. She doesn't leave him because she stopped loving him. She leaves because she thinks she's holding him back. The film excels at something I wish more modern filmmakers embraced: the sheer vitality of its supporting cast. Like the Coen brothers, Sturges fills his world with people who feel so alive, you want to follow them into their own spin-off movies. From the weenie king at the start of the movie to the chaotic ale and quail club hunters who turn a train ride into a riotous, drunken hijack. Then there is Mary Astor's character and her companion Toto, a silent, unidentifiable house guest who simply materializes in rooms and steals every single scene that he's in the back half of the movie. Rudy Valley is absolutely delightful as John D. Hackensacker III. He plays a sheltered, socially awkward billionaire with a sweetness that keeps him from ever becoming a traditional villain in this film. Watching him attempt to woo Colbert is endlessly entertaining because it highlights the film's central question: the difference between loving someone for who they are versus what they can provide, like money, security, and status. The dialogue is whip fast and razor sharp, delivering all-time one-liners like,
"That's one of the tragedies of this life, that the men who are most in need of a beating up are always enormous."
While the ending feels a bit abrupt, wrapping up about 15 minutes before the madcap energy is fully spent, the final shot, in my opinion, was a stroke of genius. It recontextualizes a confusing opening sequence in a way that is incredibly meta for a 1940s film, essentially suggesting that the entire prologue of the film belonged to an entirely different movie. At its heart, the Palm Beach Story asks what love and marriage really mean. Joel McCrea's character is essentially given the opportunity to be bought out of his marriage. Claudette Colbert's character is trying to secure money from her billionaire suitor so that her husband can fulfill his dreams and continue his work. Joel McCrea could take the money, he could walk away and never see his wife again, or he could choose love. Ultimately, he chooses love over everything else, and that's when Claudette Colbert's character finally recognizes his true value. So yeah, a really solid movie, another win for Preston Sturges after I watched Sullivan's Travels last year, and a great way to kick off my 2026 Criterion Challenge. L'Argent was my first Robert Bresson film, which already feels like a confession that I should be making quietly, maybe in the back of a video store that no longer exists instead of here on YouTube. And somehow it feels fitting, maybe suspiciously fitting, that I started with his last one, since I can't say that I'm itching to go any further. Put your pitchforks down and let me explain. I'll say this up front. I'm getting to that age where I don't feel the need to defend my taste quite as much as I used to. I don't feel obligated to convince myself that something worked just because it's important or canonical or because there's a Criterion essay explaining all the ways in which I'm wrong. I'm not going to spend this entire section trying to justify L'Argent to myself or trying to decode what I think Bresson meant. That work has already been done extensively by people who are much smarter than me and much more ensnared by this film. You can find their essays. They're beautifully written. They use a lot of poetic language, and in my opinion, they inflate this film's meaning pretty heavily. Almost every step of the way watching L'Argent, I had the same experience. Excitement followed by disappointment over and over. Like, oh, okay, here we go. Oh, okay, no, never mind. I kept thinking that Bresson was making the wrong choice every step of the way, not just once, at every possible turn. Let's start with the thing that bothered me the most, and probably the thing that inspired the likes of Michael Haneke more than anything else in his life. Because, come on, if Haneke wasn't inspired by Bresson's entire filmography, he was absolutely inspired by L'Argent. I have to talk about the characters, or rather the anti-characters. This movie is told in the most aggressively matter-of-fact way imaginable. The actors don't feel like actors. Bresson famously called them models, and they recite their lines like they're just reading a grocery list. There's no inflection, no warmth, no personality. Bresson preferred non-actors and directed them to perform as stiffly and flatly as possible, which is a choice, a big one, and yes, plenty of filmmakers have borrowed from this approach. Some have done interesting things with it, some haven't. At times, I found myself thinking about Wes Anderson, who took this kind of deadpan delivery and somehow made it playful and musical and even emotional. But here, I just couldn't get past it. The performance style was the wall that I kept running into. Because here's the thing, and this is probably where my bias shows, I like movies where people behave like people. I even like movies where people behave like exaggerated, heightened, maximalist versions of people. Give me Tarantino characters talking too much, laughing too loud, bleeding out in the back of a car too much. I'll take that. But when you strip away all humanity, when no one smiles, no one jokes, no one reacts like a person might, that's kind of where I start shutting down. There's a moment in this where Ivan is being sentenced to 3 years in prison. He stares blankly at the judge, no anger, no fear, no confusion, nothing. There's nothing to read on his face. And the second that happened, I felt myself disengage. I stopped leaning in. And it's not just the performances. The cinematography, while undeniably influential, often feels plain, even lazy. Again, I could see the lineage. Haneke, again, waving from the distance, but influence alone doesn't make something compelling. And then there's the film's idea. The movie is called L'Argent, which is French for the money, and it's clearly aiming to be a commentary on capitalism and what a money-driven society does to people. It makes them greedy, it makes them dishonest, it makes them narrow-minded. Money becomes the only thing that matters. The setup to this film is great. A high school student uses a counterfeit bill at a photography shop. That bill sets off a chain reaction that ruins Ivan's life. He gets arrested, he's sentenced to prison, he loses his job, he loses his wife, and while he's incarcerated, his daughter dies from an illness. It's bleak, and there's a clear sort of cause and effect at play, at least at first. Because initially, I thought the movie was going to do something really interesting, follow the counterfeit bill itself as it passed from hand to hand, a kind of social experiment, a philosophical takedown of the meaninglessness we ascribe to little strips of paper with faces on them. You could get a map of moral decay, you could make a screwball comedy out of it, or a tragic mosaic. The Simpsons basically did this in an episode, but then again, what haven't they done? But L'Argent abandons that idea pretty quickly. Instead, the film narrows its focus almost entirely onto Ivan, and that's where things start to fall apart for me. Because the movie wants us to believe that everything that happens to Ivan is a direct result of that initial counterfeit bill. But that only works if we ignore Ivan's choices. After his arrest, nothing forces him to commit further crimes. Yes, he loses his job. Yes, money is tight. That's real. That's painful. Sorry, bud, but because Bresson presents everything with such emotional flatness, because Ivan never expresses urgency or fear or desperation, I never once felt that his later actions were inevitable. I never felt the pressure closing in on him. So the movie slowly stops being about money at all. It becomes about watching a man return to crime because that's what the movie says he does. And once that happens, the entire opening setup starts to feel a little bit unnecessary. About an hour in, I remember thinking, why did we need the counterfeit bill in the first place? You could remove it entirely and the movie would function pretty much the same way. People making bad decisions, suffering consequences, moving forward without reflection. At that point, the film felt less like a critique of capitalism and more like a bleak shrug at human behavior. Now, I'll be fair, I'm not saying that there's nothing here. People have written genuinely thoughtful criticism about this movie, and I encourage anyone interested to read it. But my experience of L'Argent was punishing. It was frustrating and emotionally hollow. Bresson seems determined to deny us access to his characters' inner lives, as if there is no inner life to access. By the end of the film, Ivan commits theft, he goes to prison, he commits murder, and none of it seems to mean anything to him. There's no goal, there's no desire, not even money, really. Which brings me back to the title. Why is the movie called The Money? I think ultimately I'm just tired of movies that present the world as entirely dehumanized, anonymous, and alienating, especially when they offer nothing beyond that perspective. I get that a philosophically inclined aging French filmmaker might want to depict the world this way, but it's not a worldview that I connect with. It's not one I agree with, and even if I did, I can't say I get much out of how it's executed here. That said, because I'm not a monster, there are things that work. There's no such thing as a bad film. The bank robbery sequence is genuinely compelling. Bresson is excellent at showing you something without explaining it, forcing you to actively engage. There's a moment near the end where Ivan enters a hotel, then we cut, and suddenly he's walking down a staircase later that night, covered in blood. There's no explanation, there's no context, and I remember thinking, wait, what just happened? And that confusion is exactly what Bresson wants. It's effective, it's unsettling, and it sticks with you. There are plenty of Bresson films on my list. Pickpocket, A Man Escaped. After L'Argent, am I rushing to watch them? No. I'll get there eventually. But L'Argent left a sour taste in my mouth. And maybe that says as much about me as it does about the movie. Okay, this one was a pleasant surprise. There are those of a certain disposition who despise and even go out of their way to avoid films that depict this level of class elitism, even when the film itself is critical or mocking. I am not of that disposition. I found this to be a refreshing look into a subculture, can you call it that, of young adults who are children of wealthy parents, essentially navigating their way through what amounts to rich people's summer camp. Only instead of campfires and swimming, it's debutante balls and after parties in a wintry Manhattan. This rat pack finds one another, and over the course of a little more than a week, they mingle, they talk philosophy and politics, and wax on endlessly about their own privilege. As someone who practically made the entire Gen X slacker movie ethos his personality at 16, and who am I kidding, that vibe never left, I honestly felt right at home in this little universe. Not at home in the sense that I could relate to their class status, but cinematically at home. You have a group of know-it-alls growing into versions of themselves that slowly realize that they don't, in fact, know it all. There's a transient nature to their principles and beliefs that feels universal. Yes, even to those not born into privilege. And before I get too far without mentioning it, I found this film to be very, very funny. I have to imagine that Wes Anderson was inspired, at least in part, by this film because the humor feels incredibly Andersonian, or I suppose Stillmanian. Like the best films, it balances dry, deadpan humor with moments of genuine insight, volleying them back and forth. Scrolling through the IMDb quotes page gives you an idea of how many quotables fly by you without even noticing. When Tom introduces to the group that he believes in the teachings of a 19th century French social critic Fourier, and Charlie perks up and asks, "You're a Fourierist?" I nearly burst out laughing. It's a very particular flavor of comedy that certainly won't work on everyone, but from that moment on, I knew that I was in good hands. I found myself getting swept up in these characters, seeing them as less Patrick Bateman the teenage years or some late 80s version of what I imagined Downton Abbey or Gossip Girl to be about, and more as a classic tale. Classic as in Jane Austen, perhaps, of a coming of age in your early 20s. And it does what all films that do this tend to do. It introduces characters who represent different ideas while still behaving with lived-in, differentiated humanity. The character of Nick is essentially a Randall Graves or Banky Edwards of this little rat pack. He says things to ruffle feathers, and his devotion to the truth sometimes earns him a fist to the face. Tom is a sheep in wolf's clothing. Charlie is the bespectacled, contrarian intellectual. Fred is the partier. Audrey is a sensitive appreciator of art and literature. Cynthia is the promiscuous one. Jane is the queen bee, appearing much older and wiser than the rest. So while on the surface we're dropped into a snobby upper crust setting, Stillman subtly injects the same age-old familiarity beneath it all. I know some people will bump up against the hyper-literary nature of the film, the 20-year-olds with declarative opinions on Marxism and French social critics, but I believe that's mostly window dressing for a far more poignant and timeless story about what it actually feels like to be a young adult. When films reflect things back at us, especially some uncomfortable truths, it can be difficult to look away and yet so easy to admire. As much as I hate, and maybe hate is a strong word to admit it, I saw quite a lot of myself in these characters. The youthful certainty that the world was firmly one way, the belief that my principles would seamlessly carry over into every stage of my life, and the foolish idea that fleeting relationships were anything but fleeting. I have many more thoughts on this film, and it honestly grows on me the more that I sit with it, but for now, I'll say this. It's a charming work that mixes old money socialites with a scrappy, tiny budgeted, independent French New Wave spirit, a combination that I wouldn't have expected to work nearly this well. It's kind of perplexing that we don't talk about Whit Stillman in the same way we talk about other early 90s indie boom filmmakers like Linklater or Kevin Smith or Steven Soderbergh and so on. I'm genuinely curious why he didn't become more of a go-to figure for this kind of film. Warren Beatty casting two of his real-life ex-girlfriends to play his love interests while he plays a womanizing hairdresser is the kind of chaotic meta-energy we just don't see in Hollywood anymore. It's wild, it's messy, and it makes Shampoo feel like a time capsule of a very specific, ego-driven era of filmmaking. After finishing Shampoo, I immediately wanted to program a triple feature with films like Red Rocket and Marty Supreme. It's clear that those films are heavily indebted to what Hal Ashby and Warren Beatty were doing here in Shampoo. This movie takes Beatty's Don Juan public persona and just manifests it into a physical form. It's bumbling, it's seductive, and it's deeply confused. I'll be honest, I think this might be a film you had to be there for to get the full impact. Unlike Red Rocket, which uses the 2016 presidential election as a clear, loud backdrop, the politics in Shampoo are a much more poke-you-in-the-ribs undercurrent. It's set on Election Eve in 1968 as Nixon is about to take the White House, but the characters are just too busy in their own orgiastic counterculture party to notice the world is changing around them. There's a specific feeling here of the nagging pull of civic duty versus the day-to-day burdens of just existing, or in George's case, just trying to open a hair salon and sleep with everyone in Beverly Hills. I struggled with some of the era-specific references, like the offhand mention of a kid dying on his way to Camp Pendleton, which could have been a gut punch in 1975, but felt like an ancient legend to me in 2026. And then there's the Hal Ashby of it all. This is my third Ashby film, and the man was a chameleon. He had this incredible knack for weaving humor, heart, and heavy politics into a single narrative. That said, it wasn't until the final 30 minutes that it finally clicked for me that this movie's actually a farce. The movie almost tricks you. It pretends to be one thing and then subtly transitions into a two dates at the prom situation where George is at a party where the only person he hasn't slept with is his boss, played by Jack Warden. And, speaking of Jack Warden, he is the absolute MVP of this movie. He gets cucked twice and still manages to steal every single scene he's in. Julie Christie and Lee Grant are also powerhouses here, grounding the film, while Beatty mostly just makes confused faces for 2 hours. I'm putting Shampoo in the category of films I could be convinced are better than I initially thought. It didn't floor me, but it's a fascinating, cynical look at the end of an era, or the end of something, even if that something never really existed for me. Have you ever watched a masterpiece and realized about halfway through that you might just be too undereducated to actually connect with it? Well, that was my experience with Jean-Luc Godard's Weekend. It's a film that made me turn down the volume on my TV and ask, Jean-Luc, my man, did you really have to do that? This feels like if you took Linklater's Waking Life, mixed it with the opening hour of Beau is Afraid, and then shook it up in a French New Wave blender. Now, I'm a Godard fan by nature, but this film marked a shift in his style, one that I tend to buck against. He was getting fed up with what movies were meant to look like. Weekend is less a narrative and more of a colorful, ideologically dense, narratively loose political lecture. The setup is clear enough. A couple is driving to a parent's house to collect an inheritance, but along the way they're interrupted by an Alice in Wonderland-esque mosaic of side characters and tangents. I usually enjoy watching a filmmaker play with the form, even if that playfulness veers into annoyance. But Godard's insistence on, an extended dolly shot of a traffic jam overloaded with a bombardment of honking horns actually made me mute my TV. Yet there are times that the playfulness works, like the sequence involving a tractor accident where the characters argue while onlookers stare into the camera. You can see the influence on Spike Lee all over those shots. I would say that much of this film outstays its welcome, though, and to circle back, left me scratching my head, self-aware and self-conscious of my own intellectual or political limitations. By dropping you into this Beau is Afraid-esque world, Jean-Luc Godard is commenting, based on what I've read, on the unraveling of Rousseau's social contract and points to the inevitable disintegration into tribal atavism, which is to highlight that this is a film that will be tricky to latch onto if you're not someone in tune with the socio-political climate of France or the world in the late 1960s, or if words like Marxism or Leninism or names like Jacques Lacan are deterrents rather than invitations. Ultimately, I want to praise this film for audacity alone, but as an experience, it teeters over the edge of frustration. It's inside baseball for heavy concepts. You might even breeze past the parody of Ingmar Bergman's persona in the opening. I know that I did until I read the Criterion essay. I've realized that I prefer my films to be accessible in a way that this film rarely was. It's visually inventive and always alive, much like Slacker, but the discomfort won out. When that final fin popped up on the screen, I didn't ponder the mysteries of the universe. I just stood up off my couch and said, all right, cool. And I moved on with my life. I saw a single clip of Peter Reigart witnessing the aurora borealis in a remote Scottish village, calling his billionaire boss from a janky red phone booth just to describe the sky, and I was instantly sold on this film. I went into Local Hero expecting a tale as old as time, but what I got was a movie that constantly knocked me off my axis of expectation. When you look up Bill Forsyth's work, you'll see words like gentle or wry or whimsical, and those are all accurate, but in the case of Local Hero, they're almost used as a distraction. On the surface, it's a familiar setup. A ruthless Texas oil company sends a businessman named Mac to a remote Scottish village to buy up the land for a refinery. We assume that Mac will fall for the simplicity of the village and have a change of heart and save the town. But Forsyth throws curveball after curveball. For one, the oil magnate's boss, played by a wonderful Burt Lancaster, isn't this heartless villain. He's a sky-obsessed weirdo with a therapist who takes negging way too seriously. And then there's the town itself. Mac does fall in love with the place, but the locals, they want to be bought. They're actively conspiring to drive up the price through tactful negotiations. They aren't beholden to some ancient way of life. They want the money. It's a brilliant subversion of the Holy Land stereotype of Scotland that you see in movies like Brigadoon. The moments in between are where the film really shines. There's no big romantic subplot for our lead. Instead, the only real blossoming romance is between a local Scotsman, played by a very young Peter Capaldi, and a marine biologist who has webbed feet. The cinematography is stunning, it's rich, it's textured, and it captures the Scottish skyline beautifully. But I'll be honest, while I had a good time, it was a puzzling time. The humor is so dry, it's almost unregisterable, and by leaning so hard into subverting expectations, I think the film occasionally gets in its own way on the heart front. By the end, Mac is roaming the town like he belongs there, but I never felt like that connection was truly fleshed out. It felt a bit superficial, like the film glossed over the moments that make a relationship feel lived in. But still, Bill Forsyth is a filmmaker who has been somewhat brushed aside by time, but his influence on Scottish cinema is massive. He insisted on portraying Scotland in a different light, bringing international interest to a scene that really paved the way for the 90s indie boom in Scotland. Local Hero didn't exactly blow my hair back. if I had any. But it's a charming, environmentally conscious film that asks grand questions about where we call home in an age of modern convenience. It's a worthwhile trip, and I definitely recommend you take it. Is Barbra Streisand actually undeniable? I know, put the pitchforks away. I went into the 1968 classic Funny Girl expecting to be dazzled by a Star is Born moment, but instead, I found myself checking my watch and wondering why a movie about a comedy legend spends so much time on a guy that she barely knows. I'm a bit puzzled as to why this is so beloved. I'm always in the mood for a 60s musical romantic comedy, but for me, this film mildly fails at all three of those genres. I didn't find it very funny, I wasn't convinced by the romance, and the music, with a few exceptions, just wasn't that memorable compared to heavy hitters like Cabaret or Singin' in the Rain or West Side Story or Fiddler on the Roof. My biggest issue is the narrative pivot. The first 30 minutes set up a fantastic story about Fanny Brice following her dreams no matter the cost. But then Nikki Arnstein enters the picture. Within what feels like a combined 48 hours of screen time, Fanny ditches her Ziegfeld career goals to chase this tall, rich stranger. It's incredibly odd that a movie called Funny Girl becomes so obsessed with her husband. By the end of the movie, she's singing about how whatever my man is, I am his forevermore. It feels regressive, even for a biopic. Fanny also has a major lack of struggle. In most rise to fame stories, you see the rejection, you see the grit. Here, the club owner mocks her skinny legs. She sings one song and then suddenly she's a superstar. From there, she just gets everything. She forces Ziegfeld to bend the knee to her whims. She gets the guy, she gets the mansion, and even gets to keep her job after abandoning the company. I was desperately seeking stakes that weren't, oh, I love this handsome gambler, but he's so aloof. Why wasn't the movie about her struggle to be a song and dance lady despite her appearance? That dream is alluded to but constantly diluted by the love story. Again, the music didn't hit for me. Streisand is a powerhouse, obviously, but I wasn't seeing the wow factor that the script kept telling me was there. Most of the songs lack the melody and the rhythm to actually stand out. Don't Rain on My Parade is an undeniable banger, but the rest honestly just felt like filler. I'll give the film this. William Wyler and his cinematographer are doing God's work. The Swan Lake sequence where the camera roves upward to peer down at the dancers is absolutely dazzling. The colors are bold, they're saturated, and the editing keeps a long runtime feeling pretty zippy. The final act drama regarding the embezzlement and Nikki's resentment is actually pretty interesting, but it feels like it belongs in a different movie. I wish this film were funnier, I wish the music stuck. Most of all, I wish it were Fanny's film, not a film about Fanny in relation to her husband. Now, if you're mad at me for being hard on this Oscar winner, just wait. I watched this as a double feature with the 1975 sequel, Funny Lady, and I've got a major hot take incoming. I think that the sequel is actually a much better movie. Let's find out why. Okay, so as I just alluded to, I feel like I'm being punked. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. I feel like the world has conspired to play a practical joke on me. You see, Funny Girl from 1968 sits at a 4.0 and 7.4 on Letterboxd and IMDb, respectively, and Funny Lady from 1975 sits at a 3.0 and 6.2 on Letterboxd and IMDb, respectively. Now, will someone please, for the love of God, explain to me how that is, because Funny Lady is miles better than Funny Girl. It's weird that we live in a world where that's a hot take, if I'm being honest. Not only is this miles better, it makes Funny Girl a better movie as an extension of the Fanny Brice story. Nearly all of the issues that I had with Funny Girl are course corrected here in this sequel 7 years after the original. First, we have a story about Fanny that features a romance, but it still remains Fanny's story. James Caan, who I'll have a lot to say about in a minute, serves as a true supporting player in this film, bursting in to steal a scene or two, but largely remaining a character in Fanny's story, unlike Nikki in Funny Girl. The music, while still lacking in the memorability department, mainly due to the style of song choice and lack of jaunty melody and so forth, still stands out in the moment in a big way. Streisand didn't really do it for me in Funny Girl, but here, I'm seeing the magic. I'm seeing why Fanny Brice was this undeniable figure, which was a feeling that was absent in Funny Girl. But even the staging and choreography get more time to shine here. Numbers like It's Gonna Be a Great Day, or I Found $1 Million Baby in a 5 and 10 cent store, or Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie, performed like a madman by Ben Vereen, are all dazzling to watch in the same way all the best movie musicals are. They're colorful, they mix song, dance, camera choreography, bold colors, and lighting to make an experience come alive. Thanks to the wonderful cinematography from James Wong Howe, who came out of retirement to shoot this, his final film. And then you have even subtler numbers like Barbara singing How Lucky Can You Get alone on a stage, which feels so intentionally done that it's hard to look away from. I found this whole film very difficult to look away from. The humor and liveliness are here in a big way, mostly due to the electric chemistry between Fanny and Billy. The decision to showcase their evolution from strangers to butting head collaborators, to Fanny at her wits' end with him, to true collaborators, to a flawed married couple, to a doomed long-distance romance, was, I thought, brilliant. It makes this musical feel more lived in and human than its predecessor. In the years that followed the original, Funny Girl, not only did performance styles evolve, but the movie musical evolved. You can clearly see it watching these two films back to back. Funny Lady I see as a film comprising of pre-1960s saturated theatricality of the classic movie musical with a more grounded, murky, morally complex, and human texture of the 1970s. It very much feels like a musical made post-cabaret. Streisand is dynamite in this, as I mentioned. It's crazy to me that she won Best Actress for Funny Girl and was left off the nominations for this one. I could list several scenes in this that I would consider Oscar-worthy. Her seeing Nikki again in her dressing room all the way through the song How Lucky Can You Get, a complete reimagining of that song, is some masterful work. The scene of her and Nikki near the end, her whole toothbrush monologue was also heartfelt and beautiful, and you have the scene of her and Billy at the train station at the end. I could go on and on. I felt Fanny in this far more than I did in Funny Girl, and maybe it's because she becomes a legacy character by virtue of being in two films, and so you could grow with her a bit, even though I watched these a couple days apart. And that leads me to my other gripe about Funny Girl that I mentioned before, which is the fact that I frankly didn't buy the romance between Fanny and Nikki. But here, you bet your ass I buy Fanny and Billy. I have to give major props to James Caan. He brilliantly dances the many lines between the arrogant hustler, charming womanizer, nervous young man, and flawed husband. One minute, you kind of hate him, with the same smirk as Fanny when you realize, okay, he's kind of cute. The next, you're pissed off at Fanny for being so obsessed with Nikki, and then you're swooning over his plea to be really married to Fanny, and then you want to smack him for what he does, only you quickly forgive him, or at the very least understand his decision. The scene in Billy's bedroom with Fanny after she surprises him at the aquacade sequence is truly one of those why don't more people talk about this scenes that makes me look around at the overwhelming lack of love for this film with puzzled confusion. Truly, that scene felt like old school movie magic. I was locked in, two performers in a room, some dazzling dialogue, motive shifting, emotions morphing, a slow push in on a two-shot at the end. It's dazzling, I tell you. If I were a film teacher, I'd be using that scene as a lesson. I won't spoil the ending, but when Billy, with his head down at the train station, says,
"To her, I'm Nick,"
I found it to be devastating, and it's devastating in a way that Funny Girl's ending just isn't. Funny Girl's ending feels like it's Nick's problem that drives them apart because Nick is such a large figure in that story, but here, we're made certain that this is still Fanny's story. Their whole relationship failing isn't because of Fanny's hang-up with her ex-husband throughout the film. Billy truly wanted the love that Fanny showed for Nick, but he simply never got it. And when Fanny finally finds that love after reckoning with her feelings for Nick and rushes home, she discovers that it was too late. That sometimes in life you learn the lesson too late. Going back and rewatching scenes from this, I'm sucked in all over again. I'm charmed, I'm moved, and I'm bursting with energy to sing its praises from the rooftops. That being said, I have some quick gripes. The film loses steam in the back half. It abandons the song and dance energy in favor of the relationship drama, much like the original, only this time it's more emotionally nuanced and interesting. The musical numbers, as I said, could have more staying power. The decision to make Fanny the primary focus of the musical numbers still kind of irks me. I'd like some of the supporting players to have some moments to shine. We get some glimpses of James Caan singing, and I think I just wanted some duets or something. The film is a touch on the long side, but frankly, I rarely felt it. All of this is to say that I get truly and utterly confused when a film like this enters my orbit, something that I would have otherwise probably never given the time of day. I mean, just look at those numbers that I mentioned before. Those are not great numbers, but by my metric, those are incorrect numbers. Those are numbers that lead me to say pretty declaratively, hey world, you got this one wrong. You had a good run at being right about a lot of things, and truly, you should be proud of that. But in this one tiny area, you got it wrong. It happens to the best of us. It's nothing to be ashamed about, but you're wrong, plain and simple. All right, so how did a skin flick director and a legendary Pulitzer Prize-winning film critic team up to write a satirical, psychedelic, nude-filled rock and roll melodrama for a major Hollywood studio? The story behind Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is just as insane as the movie itself. And trust me, this movie is absolutely batshit. Where do I start with this one? I guess maybe the best place to start is why this exists in the first place. Skinflick filmmaker Russ Meyer caught the attention of the head of Fox, Richard Zanuck, after the success of his film Vixen, a $70,000 movie that grossed $6 million. It also caught the attention of the Chicago Sun-Times film critic Roger Ebert. Yes, that Roger Ebert. Zanuck wanted to develop a sequel to the film Valley of the Dolls from 1967, and so Russ and Roger got to work on writing Beyond the Valley of the Dolls in the wake of the Manson murders, in which one of the victims was Valley of the Dolls star Sharon Tate. What they ultimately came up with was a satire and send-up of sorts of the oftentimes nightmare world of show business, in which an all-girl rock band, tired of playing high school proms, goes to Los Angeles with the hopes of making it big. Through some family connections, they meet Ronnie Z-Man Barzell and his cohort of actors, producers, fashion icons, and porn stars. This film hits the ground running and really never stops, with an awesome soundtrack and a pop art Bauhaus color palette, zippy editing, almost too zippy at times, goofy character archetypes, even goofier one-liners, and plenty of nudity. The late 60s sensibility might be off-putting to some, and at times this extreme version of that vision is off-putting to me too, but if you could stomach something like the Monkees film Head, then you'll feel right at home. So I'll stop beating around the bush. This is just a fun time at the movies. It's got the schlock appeal while also being injected with the feeling that these guys know what they're doing, in the sense that Ebert and Meyer are intellectuals making anti-intellectual art, if that makes sense. They're aware of the melodramatic tropes in storytelling, and they use them for parody and absurdism in a way that doesn't talk down to its audience or make them feel bad for enjoying schlocky melodrama or giallo-esque nudie flicks. And beyond all that, the film is competently made with bold, striking production design, some performances that are so bad they're good, and some that are just bad and going for it, like Z-Man in particular. This is a film that's difficult to talk about as a sum of its parts because the parts are so ridiculous, but ridiculously watchable. The various love affairs and their troubles that unfold are unique. You have Kelly and Lance and the Inheritance, Casey and Roxanne, Pet and Emerson dealing with Randy Black. All the while, Harris is being persistently pursued by a nymphomaniac porn star, Ashley St. Ives. Aunt Susan has fallen back with an old flame played by Charles Napier, and Z-Man has been secretly lusting after Lance the whole time. And I feel like I've been talking about this film and I barely scratched the surface of what actually happens in this movie. So much is packed into 110 minutes of screen time. At one point, at Z-Man's first party, as different characters are ogling at others and whispering secrets about them to their neighbors, I was imagining that this must be what the Downton Abbey movies are like. And yeah, that's the second Downton Abbey reference in this video. It has the energy of an Agatha Christie chamber piece novel where you need to pay attention to the blips of expositional dialogue, as they will come in handy later on. Sometimes the economy of storytelling is a bit much, as scenes transition without so much as a breath into one another, and there's no use in mucking about trying to poke holes in the plot or do the usual criticism things, because this just isn't that type of movie. This is a bit of a sensory experience, playing with conventions of a certain breed of filmmaking that pushes our expectations to their limits. It's beautiful to look at in more ways than one, if you know what I mean. It has a rocking soundtrack, some campy performances, some hilarious dialogue, plenty of just go with it plot developments, and at the heart of it, a genuine cautionary tale about the allure and danger of the LA city where dreams come true mythos. Cinema, as with life, is full of characters making decisions that are difficult to understand. That's both the beauty and the great tragedy of living sometimes. I don't know about any of you, but I've found that I go to the movies to better understand the tangible world around me and the people in it. The danger when doing so is that films tend to be calculated, regimented, predictable, and meaningful, while real life is chaotic, nuanced, confusing, and sometimes lacking in definitive meaning. So when a film comes along with a character like Gelsomina, a seemingly charming young woman with a face consisting of the largest, saddest eyes on the planet and as expressive as Charlie Chaplin, there's a certain expectation for how the story is going to go. The expectation is founded not only on storytelling conventions, but also on conventions of how we'd like to believe the world operates. But of course, when the story and the world doesn't operate in that manner, it has the potential to send the film into a tailspin. Now, I don't necessarily think that happens here. If anything, Gelsomina's seemingly strange decisions to martyr herself and stay with Zampano, even after he's been physically, verbally, and mentally abusive and makes no effort to indicate that he even enjoys her company, made me lean into the screen, searching for clues. The performances are all incredible, and it's clear to see why Giulietta Messina became the star that she did. I'll point it out again, but that face has some kind of magic in it. Anthony Quinn has maybe the toughest job here because he behaves in a way that is so believably detestable that I was repelled by him, but by the end, he has to play so many conflicting emotions. The whole time, the film deliberately invites you to imagine the Hollywood ending, and slowly it drifts away from that possibility. You want to imagine that Gelsomina becomes a vaudevillian star, that her talent is recognized by the fool or by the owner of the roving circus, that Zampano gets some form of comeuppance for his shitty behavior. You want to believe in a world where that's true, but this isn't that world. The other meta aspect is knowing the Fellini of post-La Strada, the more whimsical, fanciful, fantastical Fellini, the one who leans more into the dreamscape and away from reality. The cinema of excess is nowhere to be found in La Strada. Gelsomina is portrayed by Messina as a child following her neglectful father across rural Italy. She latches onto him with no sense of free will, no ability to fathom that she could leave if she wanted to. She's given multiple opportunities to do so, and at every turn, she turns them down. Not only does she listen to Zampano, but the fool's speech about the pebble and its purpose is both inspiring and a bit dangerous, given its vagueness and how Gelsomina ultimately interprets it. The fact that the fool points her back in the direction of Zampano at all is another one of those head-scratching subversions that makes this film both an exotic curio and a frustrating oddity. As for the filmmaking itself, the film is restrained in a way that one might not expect from Fellini. He was still coming into his own, and it wasn't until the massive success of La Strada and the first Academy Award for International Feature that he was able to spread his wings and fly. The final shot of this film is one that I'm still thinking about, and I imagine I will for a long time. There are definitely formal and technical elements that you could tell inspired the likes of Scorsese and Kurosawa. I'm sure much of what I've said already makes little to no sense, and that pretty much sums up my thoughts on this. I'm intrigued, which is always a good thing, but that doesn't 100% make up for the feeling of being robbed of the fantasy story. I could appreciate the film on an allegorical level. It works as a moral tale, something to get the brain juice flowing, but anytime you have a story centered around a character who might do something to change the trajectory of the plot, only to fall right back in place, it could get tiresome and ultimately not very satisfying. Now, there's a version of this in which I'm checked out completely, and thankfully, that isn't here. That's mostly due to the performances, which truly knocked me over, and enough emotional ups and downs to make the ride feel like a ride, even if the ride is the invitation of hope and yanking of that hope. I'll be thinking of this for some time, but as an enjoyable film-going experience, this didn't fully work for me. Listen, I had a doggone blast with this one. To get the elephant in the room out of the way up front, a comedy movie about fascism, Nazis, and Hitler shouldn't work, especially in 1942. People have done it since, like Jojo Rabbit, for example, and whenever it does happen, it feels as though inevitably some folks will call it tasteless or inappropriate. The humor in this is at times eyebrow-raising, and obviously, taking it from a great distance here in 2026, It's more front and center than the horrific implications. One of the jokes that landed so hard with me was the repetition of,
"So they call me concentration camp Erhard."
This film has a chilliness to it with regard to World War II and the Holocaust that reminded me of, hang in there for a second, Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest. The Zone of Interest focuses on the banality of evil, with the camp in the background where the barrier between hell and earth has been shattered, being this ever-present reminder, a lingering, looming threat of humanity's own capacity for cruelty. In To Be or Not to Be, the same feeling lurks underneath, but the foreground is playful and zippy, and it doesn't make you feel like you need to take a shower afterward. Not that there's anything wrong with The Zone of Interest, it's just, rightfully so, is a tough film. To explain the plot in its totality would take some of the magic out of it, but in essence, it's about a group of Polish stage performers during the invasion of Warsaw who used their talents for theater to spy on and infiltrate the Gestapo and destroy the Nazi plans to kill the underground resistance movement. You've got Jack Benny as a cuckolded actor who's less famous than his wife, played by Carole Lombard, in her final screen performance because of a tragic plane crash that happened not long after filming this movie, who then becomes flirtatious with a Polish aviator played by Robert Stack. Along the way, Jack Benny needs to put on disguises, go behind enemy lines, and pretend to be a Gestapo colonel, and then a Gestapo professor spy with sensitive information. All the while, the Nazis are portrayed as bumbling and incompetent. Colonel Erhardt's dynamic with his underling Schultz
"Schultz! How dare you put me in this position?"
was one of my other favorite running gags. But not all of them are bumbling, incompetent villains played for laughs. Professor Seletsky is an all-too-familiar, pragmatic type of evil, one that's less concerned with which side to align yourself with ideologically, but which side is the winning side. His scene with Maria, Carole Lombard, is actually the most chilling moment of the film for me. Now, invoking current events and politics into a movie review for a film from 1942 seems tricky, but hopefully I don't have to do a lot of convincing to see some parallels. The idea that Seletsky sees himself as a human and not a monster, while in the background we all know the atrocities he's willing to turn a blind eye to, make that humanness all the more terrifying. We can only think about Nazis and fascists as being mustache-twirling psychopaths, but the truth is that they could be as regular as your Aunt Ruthie and Uncle Jim. They're the guy that you see at the deli or your child's gym teacher, and as Seletsky says, missing the sarcasm of Maria's response,
I wonder if you really know what Nazism stands for.
I have a slight idea.
In the final analysis, all we're trying to do is to create a happy world.
And people who don't want to be happy have no place in this happy world. Well, that makes sense.
Conviction and certainty of something that is simply untrue makes the speaker seem more than unhinged. They seem delusional. And I don't know about you, but delusion scares the shit out of me. Moving away from all that, I must remind you that this film is very funny and uses repetition in a way that all the best screwball comedies and farce films of the early 20th century do. Opening with Bronski dressed as Hitler in the town square, only for no one to care because they recognize the actor, and then pay it off later with him convincing the Nazis themselves that he is Hitler, was awesome, even if they missed the opportunity to have him say,
Heil myself.
at the end. You've got the whole to be or not to be recurring joke about Joseph's cuckoldry. You've got the fact that Joseph constantly asks while in disguise, you know that
Great Polish actor, Joseph Tura. You've probably heard of him.
No, I haven't.
Oh.
it's really a masterclass in setting up a joke and playing it through to the end. All in all, this was a delight and definitely moves with vigor by the midpoint and doesn't slow down. This made me very interested in Lubitsch's work. I'll have to seek out more. The Criterion Challenge hits gold again. I know, this is one of those films I should have seen a long time ago, and there's a real what-if butterfly effect moment where I see this at 15 or 16, and it becomes one of my favorite films of all time. Seeing it for the first time now, at 29, my relationship is a bit more complicated. But I've come to love the Del Toro oeuvre so much, and I see inklings of the masterpiece that others see in this film. It's a film that cements Del Toro as a 21st century auteur, and for good reason. This film is a dark fairy tale that has universal appeal across borders, across generations, and a message that, unfortunately, is never not timely. As you could see, I watched this right after To Be or Not to Be, and here we get a separate group of fascists that are spewing the same type of ideology. Instead of the screwball comedy farce of Lubitsch's World, we get a Grimm's fairy tale version of a coming-of-age story set in Spain. I'll start off with what works, which is a lot, but overall the conception of the piece as a whole, from a fable standpoint, is incredible. To use the medium of storytelling and filmmaking to make a film with such poignancy and to commit to the tone and to the ending that we get takes a lot of guts, and I have to commend Del Toro there. The coming-of-age, uncovering the savageries of the adult world thing is one of my favorite micro-genres in cinema. You've got Stand By Me, The Florida Project, Bridge to Terabithia, The Fall, etc. These types of films often make the smart choice of mixing the fantasy with the reality. What's called low fantasy, where the fantasy world invades or commingles with our reality. It typically represents a resistance to reality, a resistance that you see all too much in folks who refuse to grow up. These stories also tend to have the fantasy world mirror or mimic the reality that the child is running from. Think of The Wizard of Oz, or Where the Wild Things Are, or the Narnia movies. Pan's Labyrinth fits neatly and in many ways stands above many of the other classic examples of the genre. It is dark, it is punishing, it is unafraid to depict evil in its purest form through the captain, who is one of the most detestable characters I could think of. And it gets at the heart of what fantasy, imagination, and storytelling have to offer, not just the world, but the individual. The ambiguity of the end I found to be perfect, though I'm also a sucker for ambiguous endings, in that it becomes a litmus test for the type of viewer or person that you are. If you choose to believe that the afterlife kingdom is real, then you may be of a certain different disposition than someone who sees the story as a pure, punishing tragedy. The ending is definitely one that I'll be thinking about for some time. And the message of anti-fascism is one that just I'll never stop applauding. The idea of blindly following a system or a doctrine or an ideology or a political party, whatever, is so relevant to today's world that I can't help but be moved anytime I see it in classic media. And yes, this film is a classic, even if it's only 19 years old. And seeing Ophelia go through some of the same stages of blind obedience and making the correct decisions at the end is perfect narrative symmetry. It's a sentiment that certain sects of people for some reason criticize as being done to death, like the same people who bemoan war films with, do we really need another film to tell us war is hell? Yes. Yes, we do. Until we get it through our thick skulls, yes, keep telling these stories, keep insisting to the blindly obedient fascists that they're on a path that only leads to human suffering and cruelty. The alternative is hand-waving and saying, I'm sure they'll figure it out on their own. If history is anything to go by, they sure won't. Sorry, but not sorry. That was a little rant. All that is to say that the adult end of this film got to me just as much as the adolescent fantasy element did. And that leads me to talk about some of the things that irk me a little bit with this film. Number one has to do primarily with expectation. I wasn't anticipating how little of this film was going to revolve around the titular Pan and his titular Labyrinth. I believe I read somewhere that the fantasy sequences in this make up about 18% of the screen time. And while I was watching, I did have a few moments of, okay, but can we get back to the fantasy? Which is a feature and a bug in a way, and it's a bit of a wash. The other irk that I have is Ophelia as a character. At a certain point, she feels like a supporting player in her own story, and not only that, she and others make decisions that feel out of left field. I think it's been much discussed online at this point, but in no way is she set up as someone who would stop and eat the grapes on the table. The whole time, she's depicted as a determined, dependable young girl. And then the movie makes the decision to have Ophelia disobey the fawn's direct orders instead of it feeling like a natural character decision. It really took me out of the film for a bit. Even later on, Mercedes' decision not to kill the captain when she could have just plunged the knife right into his neck seemed like a weak moment too, especially if her intention was just to shoot him in the head later on. Now, granted, that moment is badass as all get out when the captain is like, tell my son what time I died. And she's all like, what the dude, why the hell would I do that, loser? And then blammo. So if she kills him earlier, then we lose out on that. Again, a lot of these things are forgivable given the fable quality of the overall story. Del Toro as a filmmaker is so bold in his creativity and vision that he truly is an inspiration. I wish we had a dozen more filmmakers like him, but I'm glad he gets to stand out in the way that he does. And films like this really do put the world into perspective. This one in particular is maybe the boldest in that it doesn't overstate the appeal of the fantasy. It doesn't offer the fantasy as an escape from reality, but almost as a necessary distraction. But it also reminds you that the reality is there to be fought for and the fighting needs to happen. I think Del Toro is wrestling with that fact here. The human desire to run from reality and into the world of fairies and fauns and even monsters, because in those stories, the pure of heart always come out on top. But let's be honest, reality isn't like that. And that's one of the greatest tragedies of being alive. But in this film, he's saying that we could use storytelling and fantasy and imagination as a way of pushing through the bleakness and the hard times, and we could use them as tools for survival, even when the dark night of the soul is driving us to the edge of the cliff. Now look, I'm a sucker for a Western. I'm a sucker for John Ford ever since seeing The Searchers for the first time last year. And so this film went down like a warm glass of, apple juice. It breaks from many Western traditions and presents more of a hangout movie than I was expecting, and even more melodrama than I was expecting or really itching for. But those curveballs were more often than not welcome surprises. The story of Wyatt Earp and Tombstone and the shootout at the OK Corral is one that I know by name only. I haven't seen any of the other adaptations of the story, like Tombstone, Gunfight at the OK Corral, Hour of the Gun, Wyatt Earp, etc. And so this being my introduction, I think actually improved my viewing experience since I had no preconceived expectations for how the story would play out. Legend has it that John Ford and Wyatt Earp were friendly on the Fox lot, and Earp regaled him with stories of the OK Corral shootout. There's actually a video you could watch. Maybe I'll link it below and show a little bit of it here.
About this many times. When Wyatt Earp retired as a lawman, Henry, as you know, he went to some little town north of...
So anyway, all of that is to say that I wasn't burdened with knowing how the story was going to unfold. The way that Ford and screenwriters Winston Miller and Samuel G. Engel construct the story is pretty timeless. We meet Earp and his three brothers leading a large herd of cattle. They meet Old Man Clanton, who seems nice enough, but his brooding son next to him indicates that there's an underlying menace to the Clantons. And then later that night, while Wyatt and two of his brothers are in the town of Tombstone getting a shave, his youngest brother James is murdered and their cattle go missing. So Wyatt takes it upon himself to become Marshal of Tombstone and rid the lawless little village of all the criminals running rampant. From the beginning, there's a legend to Wyatt Earp that the folks of Tombstone know well, and that air of mythology is in plain sight. The same goes for the name Doc Holliday. When Holliday walks into the saloon and smacks the hat off the gambler and the whole place just goes quiet, the tension between Holliday and Earp is so palpable you can cut it with a knife. Now, as mentioned, the film deviates a bit from the Western playbook, but keeps all of the same themes like revenge, an American ideal of justice, etc. Its deviations come in the form of the romantic and personal lives of Earp and Holliday. Like Wyatt Earp is infatuated with a woman named Clementine who has come all the way from the East in search of Doc Holliday, but Doc Holliday wants nothing to do with her. Instead, he has a new flame named Chihuahua who is madly in love with him and is trying to run Clementine out of town. Now, I'm of two minds about this. The melodrama between Holliday and Clementine is thoughtful and never boring. The budding, unrequited romance between Wyatt and Clementine is adorable. But I can't help but see this as a bit of a distraction from what the film sets up so masterfully, the murder of James Earp. Most of the stuff between Doc returning to Tombstone and the reveal of James's killers is sort of take it or leave it, again, without ever being boring. In fact, there are truly beautiful moments sprinkled throughout, like the actor being forced up onto a table in the saloon by the Clantons, reciting To Be or Not to Be for some dangerous drunkards. There's a bit of a Hitchcockian quality to the way that these scenes are staged. When Wyatt and Doc Holliday leave with the actor, Old Man Clanton comes out and says to his sons, "When you pull a gun, kill a man before whipping them." We know this guy is up to no good here in Tombstone. The cinematography seems to oscillate between, wow, that's gorgeous, and me squinting my eyes because I can't see shit. The day for night stuff is occasionally well done, but more often than not, the underexposure and shooting men on horses from far off distances makes it difficult to keep track of the action. As mentioned, I'm mixed on the romantic subplots of the film. I'm generally a fan of the dynamic between Chihuahua, Doc Holliday, Clementine, and Wyatt, but I just think that the amount of screen time devoted to it was bordering on egregious, especially when the final shootout at the OK Corral feels like it's over in 2 minutes. Maybe we've just been spoiled with epic Western shootouts in films like The Magnificent Seven, 3:10 to Yuma, or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and so this shootout seems pretty impotent by comparison. I could go on and on about this. Westerns are one of those genres that's open to so much varied discussion, but all in all, this scratched a very particular anti-Western itch. It's deliberately slow, it's melodramatic, it's full of wonderful performances, especially from Fonda and Victor Mature, and when it does need to implement tension, it does so at a masterful level. Oh boy, we made it. Sorry about that, folks. That was a long one. I had a lot to say about these first 13 films that I watched for my 2026 Criterion Challenge. I hope you all got something out of all of that. If you want to comment on any of my commentary, do so down below. If you've seen any of these films, if I was taking a shit on your favorite movie, please let me know down in the comments. And when you're done with that, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on this channel. I got three more quarters to do on this channel for my Criterion Challenge, so you can check back in 13 weeks for quarter 2, where I'll get to the halfway point. And then when you're done with all of that, go ahead and follow me over on Letterboxd, and once you're there, you can see my list of films that I will be watching for my 2026 Criterion Challenge. When you're done following me over on Letterboxd and checking that list and maybe making a list of your own, go check out my podcast where I talk about movies with people who love movies. And if you're someone who loves movies, which if you made it this far into the video, of course you are, go head down to this email and send an email down below. And if you want to be a guest on the show, you could be a guest on the show. We'll make that happen. And with that, thank you so much for watching this roundup of my quarter 1 watches for my 2026 Criterion Challenge. I'll see you all next time.